Hey guys, tonight we begin with the forgotten misery of medieval winters, nights so cold that breath turned to frost, and silence itself seemed to freeze in the air. Stories once brushed aside as exaggeration of peasants sleeping beside animals, of water freezing inside homes, of men and women who prayed just to see the morning light, are now quietly confirmed by the traces left behind in the old stone walls of Europe. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, a journey through a world where sleep was a struggle and every winter night felt like frozen torture. It begins in silence, the kind of silence that hums in your ears when the world itself has stopped moving. The fields lie buried beneath a pale crust of snow, and the faint outline of a distant forest fades into the darkness like a forgotten memory. The wind has fallen still. Not a branch moves, not a bird calls, only the slow groan of ice, shifting somewhere unseen, reminds you that this world is still alive. In a small clearing, a cottage stands, or rather, endures. Its roof sags beneath the weight of snow, and smoke no longer rises from the chimney. The last embers inside have long since died. From a distance, it looks abandoned, but within those wooden walls, a family lies awake, their breaths shallow, their eyes open to the darkness. The air is so cold that every exhale forms a thin, ghostly cloud, drifting upward and freezing against the beams. The house itself seems to breathe with them, slow, uneven, tired. This is what night felt like in the heart of a medieval winter. The world outside was not merely cold, it was indifferent. A stillness so complete that even thoughts seemed to slow down. People spoke in whispers, if at all. The crack of frozen wood could echo for miles, and the sound of a single distant owl might make the hair on your neck rise, not out of fear, but because it proved something was still awake when everything else had gone to sleep. In those nights, time moved differently. An hour stretched into something uncertain. The dark pressed down from every direction, and the candle flame, small, trembling, looked like a living thing fighting for its last breath. It wasn't just the absence of warmth that made it brutal. It was the weight of stillness, the realization that until the sun rose again, there was nothing to do but endure. Outside, the snow formed strange patterns, ripples frozen mid-motion by the wind's last exhale. Travellers who had died along the road in daylight would vanish by morning, buried under a smooth, untouched sheet of white. Some said that winter buried the dead so gently it seemed almost kind. But by spring, when the thaw came, it revealed how cruel that silence had been. Inside, the walls were alive with sound, quiet sounds, but constant. The slow creak of wood contracting in the cold, the faint scratch of mice hidden in the thatch, the sigh of an old door swollen tight in its frame. Sometimes, in that strange hour between midnight and dawn, people would hear tapping on the walls, not loud, but rhythmic, like knuckles rapping from the other side. They would whisper that it was frost spirits, knocking to be let in. Modern historians would call it thermal contraction, but to them, it was something older, something that belonged to the dark. The cold had its own way of playing tricks. Breath would freeze on blankets, then thaw slightly as bodies shifted beneath them, creating soft crackling sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. People half asleep would swear they heard voices murmuring through the floorboards or footsteps across the roof. It was only the wind, of course, yet the wind carried a language they could almost understand. The mind, half frozen and half dreaming, began to invent company in the silence. There were no clocks, no lights, no sense of how deep the night had gone. The fire's ashes were the only measure of time, grey at midnight, cold by morning. And so they lay there, listening to their own hearts beating against the cold, waiting for the faintest sign of dawn. Some prayed. Some whispered stories to stay awake. Others stared into the dark until shapes began to move within it, forming faces that dissolved when blinked at. It wasn't madness, just exhaustion and cold weaving together to blur the line between real and imagined. Far from the cottage, the world was still stranger. Frozen rivers moaned under the ice, as if alive beneath the surface. The forest trees cracked like splitting bones. Even the stars seemed sharper, their light reflecting off the snow, until night felt brighter than day, yet empty, hollow, endless. In those hours, people believed the world had stopped breathing, that perhaps, if dawn never came, it would remain frozen forever, a perfect and silent tomb. And yet, somewhere beneath all that stillness, life went on. Beneath the floorboards, the mice continued their tiny harvests. In the barn, the last cow shifted in her sleep, her breath forming small clouds against the dark. Even the frost, creeping over windows like veins of silver, was a kind of motion, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The cold world did not rest. It only moved too slowly for human eyes to notice. There was one thing everyone feared more than the cold itself, the sudden quiet that came before the wind returned. They called it the dead minute. The air would grow heavy, the flames would stand still, and even the snow outside seemed to listen. It lasted no longer than a breath, but every person who lived through it swore that in that moment they could hear something, not a sound exactly, but a feeling, like the earth remembering how empty it could be. Afterward, the wind would return, and they'd breathe again, pretending they had imagined it. Sometimes, travellers took shelter in chapels or barns, their bodies huddled together in frozen prayer. In the morning, some would still be kneeling perfectly still, their faces soft, as though they had simply fallen asleep and chosen not to wake. Their companions would whisper that perhaps the cold had been merciful, that it had taken them gently before the true frost arrived. It's hard, now, to imagine how absolute that cold could be. Even standing outside on the coldest modern night, wrapped in layers of warmth, you still have lights, noise, motion, the hum of a world that never truly sleeps. But in those centuries, when the night fell, it was a different kind of world, a world where silence was not peaceful, but heavy, a world where the dark seemed alive and the only sound was your own shivering breath. And yet, for all its cruelty, there was something almost sacred about that stillness. In the frozen air, time itself felt delicate, breakable. People spoke softly not because they feared waking others, but because they feared disturbing the silence that kept the world from cracking apart. It was a silence that demanded respect, ancient, vast, and unmoved by human warmth. If you listen closely now, in some quiet corner of an old stone village, when the frost settles thick and the night is deep, you might still hear it, the faint echo of that frozen world, the same silence that wrapped itself around the medieval nights like a second sky. It's not an absence of sound, but a memory of it, hanging somewhere between life and nothingness. And as you imagine yourself there in that cottage, beneath a frozen roof, wrapped in damp wool, waiting for a light that never comes, ask yourself quietly, could you have slept at all? Or would you, too, have listened through the endless hours, wondering if the world outside your door was still alive, or if it had already frozen to death in its sleep? The fire was the heart of every medieval home, and yet it was a heart that beat weakly, flickering between life and death throughout the endless winter nights. For all its warmth, the fire was never enough. Its light reached only a few steps from the hearth before surrendering to the dark, and its heat faded long before it could touch the far corners of the room. In those distant corners, Frost crept along the walls like a slow, patient animal, reclaiming what little warmth humans had borrowed from the world. A single log might burn for an hour, if chosen carefully. Pine burned quickly, bright but impatient, leaving behind nothing but smoke. Oak lasted longer, though few could afford to waste it. Peat smouldered for hours, thick and smoky, filling the room with a scent that clung to skin and hair for days. But no matter what they burned, the flame never won. It was always a negotiation: heat for smoke, comfort for breath. To feed the fire meant to breathe its poison. The hearth was built not in luxury, but in defiance. Stone by stone, villagers arranged their lives around it, knowing that every spark was borrowed time. The smallest mistake, a spark landing on a straw mat, a forgotten log too dry, could turn a night of survival into one of tragedy. But to let it die was worse. A cold hearth meant starting again in the morning, coaxing a reluctant ember to life with shaking hands, praying the damp wood would catch before the frost took hold inside their lungs. They sat close to it, huddled in silence, watching the dance of light on the walls. The fire painted their faces with soft gold, turning even the tired and the sick into something almost divine. But step away, even a little, and the cold reminded them how fragile that illusion was. The air just a few feet beyond the fire's reach felt like a different world, entirely sharp, metallic, cruel. The flickering warmth was a circle of life surrounded by a sea of frozen stillness. For the poor, gathering fuel was an act of quiet desperation. Wood was scarce, and the forests were often forbidden by law. The nobility claimed the trees, leaving only fallen branches or rotted bark for peasants to scavenge. Many risked the forest anyway, sneaking through moonlight with axes wrapped in cloth to silence the blows. Some never returned, not from wolves or bandits, but from the cold itself. The irony was cruel. To find warmth, they had to face the very force that sought to kill them. Even when they succeeded, the fire they built was pitiful: a handful of twigs, a few stolen logs, a small orange eye blinking against the dark. It hissed and cracked as if protesting its own futility. The smoke filled the room, blinding and choking, forcing them to crouch low where the air was clearer. Children's eyes watered, and their mothers rubbed soot from their cheeks with numb fingers. Yet no one complained. The fire was alive, and that was enough. Some families had only embers to tend through the night, glowing fragments of yesterday's flame. They would bury them in ash before sleep, then dig them out at dawn, praying they still breathed. To lose those embers meant starting from nothing, a task that could take hours in the bitter morning air. And so, entire lives revolved around keeping that fragile spark alive, as though it were a member of the family itself, something to be guarded, whispered to, fed. But even the strongest fire could not banish the cold completely. In the rafters, frost formed icicles that dripped slowly onto sleeping faces. The walls exhaled a chill that seemed to come from deep inside the wood itself. People wore their cloaks even indoors, their breath hanging thick in the air like mist. The flame offered warmth to the hands, perhaps the face, but never the feet, never the bones. It was like trying to survive by holding sunlight in your palms. Some believed the fire had a spirit, not a friendly one, but something that demanded constant attention. If it was neglected, it would turn spiteful, dying out just to punish the household. Others swore they saw shapes move within the flames, figures dancing, bending, whispering things they couldn't quite hear. Whether born from exhaustion or from belief, it gave the night a strange sort of company. The fire, they said, remembered things. It had watched generations live and die before it, and it knew how quickly warmth could turn to ash. In larger halls where lords and their guests gathered, fires were grander but no less deceptive. Great hearths blazed beneath stone arches, and servants carried wood by the armful to keep them alive. But even there, the cold lingered like a ghost. The heat rose to the ceiling, leaving the floor numb. The servants closest to the fire sweated and coughed, while those at the table's edge shivered in silence, pretending to feel the warmth. The same illusion repeated itself, just dressed in finer clothes. The poorest sometimes burned things that were never meant to burn: furniture, straw roofs, even dried dung. The smoke was thick and bitter, coating their lungs with every breath. Yet to them, it smelled like survival. There are records of people gathering seaweed to dry, of burning bones, of grinding them into dust to mix with peat for fuel. Anything that could hold a spark was fair game. It's strange to think of bones once living, warm, returning warmth again, only through fire. There's something circular in that, something quietly tragic. And still, the nights went on. The fire dwindled, and the room fell back into shadow. People would stretch their hands toward the embers, watching the last flickers fade into darkness. They would whisper prayers to saints of warmth, or to no one at all. Some would dream of summer, not the brightness of it, but the sound, the soft hum of bees, the murmur of rivers, the sigh of leaves in the wind, sounds that reminded them the world could still move, could still breathe. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even then, even in those frozen centuries, they found small ways to hold on. A single glowing ember beneath ash, a candle guttering on a stone sill, the rhythm of someone blowing gently into a handful of kindling. These were acts of faith, not in gods or miracles, but in the fragile persistence of warmth itself. Every night was a quiet wager that the fire would survive long enough to see the sun rise again. And maybe that's what makes the image of a medieval fire so haunting. It was never a symbol of power or luxury. It was a plea, a fragile, glowing argument against the cold. A reminder that warmth was not something given, but something fought for, every hour, every breath. And as the flames dimmed to their final glow, that faint orange light became something more than heat. It became memory. Proof that, even in a world that froze everything it touched, something still dared to burn. So, the next time you watch a candle flicker or hear the soft crack of burning wood, imagine that long-ago room, the huddled figures, the breathless stillness, the cold pressing just beyond the circle of light. The fire they tended was never enough, but somehow it was all they needed to keep believing the world would wake again. A medieval bed was not a place of comfort, but of surrender. It was where the body gave up its small fight against the cold, and the night took whatever warmth it could steal. For most, the word bed was generous. It meant a sack of straw on the floor, sometimes lifted slightly by a wooden frame, often not. The straw shifted and flattened beneath the weight of sleep, and by morning, it felt as though you were lying on the earth itself, cold, uneven, and indifferent. The straw was gathered from harvest leftovers, whatever stalks could be spared without starving the animals. It was never clean. It carried dust, insects, and the faint scent of rot. By winter, it was damp too, for the cold never truly allowed anything to dry. Fleas hid deep within it, their tiny bodies warmed by the sleeper's skin. People rarely changed the bedding. To do so meant stepping out into the night to gather more straw, and no one dared risk the cold for such a luxury. And so they slept upon the same bedding for months, their heat trapped within, shared with whatever life decided to join them. Blankets were thin, often nothing more than wool that had seen too many winters. The wealthy had furs, heavy and soft, but even those could not always keep the frost away. In the poorest homes, 2 or 3 people might share one blanket, lying close as animals for warmth. There was no shame in it, just survival. The body heat of another person was the cheapest, most reliable fire of all. Some families slept in shifts so that the bed never grew cold. When one rose to tend the fire or fetch water, another would slide into the same spot, taking the still warm space like a ghost slipping into another's dream. The walls of the house offered little protection. Wind crept through cracks in the wood and stone, whispering against the skin like an unseen hand. Sometimes it moaned, making the night sound alive. People stuffed rags, moss, or straw into the gaps, but it never sealed completely. In the morning, a thin film of frost often formed along the inside walls, catching the first light like pale silver veins. The frost looked delicate, almost beautiful, until you remembered that it was born from the same breath that had left your lips in the night. Pillows were a luxury few had. Many slept with rolled-up cloaks beneath their heads, or nothing at all. The shape of the ground decided the posture of their rest, and yet there is something strange in the record's notes from travelling monks and physicians who wrote about cold dreams. They described people who would speak in their sleep of warmth, of fires, of sunlight, of heat that never came. When woken, they said their dreams had felt real enough to thaw the bones. Some believed it was the soul wandering to warmer realms while the body lay half frozen. Others said it was death itself, testing the boundaries of the flesh. There is a kind of quiet poetry in that image, the idea of warmth as a visitor, something that comes only in sleep. Imagine lying there, your breath misting above you, every inhale sharp, every exhale heavy. The straw rustles faintly beneath you, and the faint crack of frost outside sounds like a sigh. You pull the blanket closer, but the edges are stiff, frozen. You close your eyes, and perhaps, for a while, you forget the cold. In that half-dream, there is a fire, and the air smells of bread. Then you wake, and the illusion crumbles. The cold never really left, it just waited. For children, the nights were longest. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster, and many slept pressed against their parents or siblings. Some mothers wrapped their babies in rags and placed them near the dying embers, praying the heat would last till morning. But sometimes it didn't. The silence of medieval nights was not always peaceful. It was heavy, still, the kind of silence that hid grief. There are entries in old parish records, brief, unfeeling lines: child lost in frost, infant found stiff by morning. The words are cold too, as if written by the weather itself. In monasteries, the beds were not much better. The monks believed comfort was a sin, that the body should not be indulged. They slept on simple straw mats, often with no blanket at all, trusting prayer to warm what the fire could not. They rose before dawn, walking barefoot across stone floors colder than iron. Some wrote of nights where ink froze in their quills, where breath turned to crystals in their beards. Yet even they, in their discipline, confessed to the temptation of warmth, of wanting to linger in bed just a few moments longer, to feel something human before facing the chill again. What's interesting and quietly strange is how the cold shaped their sense of time. Nights were not just hours of rest, but long, layered experiences. People often slept in two shifts, the first sleep and the second sleep. Between them came a waking period when they would rise, stir the fire, whisper prayers, or simply sit in the dark. The air during those hours was thick with silence. Some said it was when dreams clung most tightly to the waking mind. Others said it was when the world felt closest to death, that thin space between one sleep and the next. In that half-light of consciousness, perhaps they found a kind of peace, or perhaps just the awareness of how endless the night truly was. And there was another sound, small, constant, and cruel, the drip of melting frost. It would form along the thatch roof, then slip down as the fire warmed the air. The drops landed on faces, hands, or straw, seeping slowly back into the bedding. People grew used to it, even timed their breaths around it. Some said the sound was soothing. Others said it was the voice of the cold itself, steady, patient, reminding them that it was still there, waiting just beyond the walls. Every once in a while, during the deepest cold, the straw would freeze too. Imagine lying down and hearing the faint crunch of it beneath your weight, stiff and unyielding. When you moved, it crackled softly, like paper being torn. The texture of sleep itself became brittle. There are even accounts, though rare, of people waking to find frost on their blankets, or their hair stiff with ice from their own breath. They would laugh about it in the morning, as though it were ordinary, but you can feel the weariness behind that laughter. It wasn't surprise, it was acceptance, and still they called it home. That same straw, that same chill, that same endless night. They made small rituals out of it. Before sleep, some whispered charms against the frost. Others placed an iron nail beneath the straw, believing it would keep evil spirits and the cold away. A few sprinkled salt along the bed edges, not for taste, but for protection. In a world where everything froze, even superstition offered a little warmth. When you imagine those beds of straw and blankets of ice, it's easy to think only of the discomfort, the hardship, but there was also a strange tenderness in it, the way people drew close, the way they shared what little heat they had, the way they accepted that the cold was part of life, not an enemy but a companion. The world outside froze, but inside those small rooms, humanity remained fragile, flickering but alive. There's a moment, right before dawn, when the cold reaches its quietest point. The stars fade and the light turns blue, soft and empty. In that hour, the beds of straw would creak as people stirred. Breath misted like smoke in the air. Somewhere, a rooster would crow, sounding more like a cough than a song. And slowly, the world would begin again. Not warmer, not kinder, but awake. So perhaps those who lived through those winters understood something we've forgotten, that warmth is not just heat, but presence. The sound of another's breathing in the dark, the faint weight of a shared blanket, the courage to sleep beneath the same frost that could so easily take you. And somehow, each morning, to rise again. The long hours before dawn were a strange kind of silence, not quite night, not yet morning. It was the time when fires burned low, when even the most restless animals had gone still, and when the cold seemed to settle more deeply into the bones. Those who lived through medieval winters often spoke of this hour, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet respect. It was when the world felt suspended, as if holding its breath between darkness and light. For many, this was the hardest part of the night. The fire, once bright and full of promise, had sunk to a bed of dull red embers. The air inside the home grew heavy, filled with the faint scent of smoke and damp straw. Every breath felt colder than the last, each one a small reminder that morning was still far away. And yet, despite the cold, few truly slept deeply during these hours. The night had its own rhythm, one that pulled people in and out of uneasy dreams. It was common then for people to wake in the middle of the night, what they called the watch. After the first sleep, they would stir, tend to the fire, or sit quietly in thought. Some prayed, others simply listened. The world outside was almost perfectly still, broken only by the groan of ice shifting on the roof, or the distant bark of a dog. The cold made even the smallest sound feel larger, sharper, as though the air itself carried it more carefully. These hours had a strange intimacy. A husband might whisper to his wife, their words soft enough not to wake the children. A farmer might rise to check the animals, walking barefoot over frozen earth, each step sending a tremor through his body. Monks in distant abbeys moved silently through cloisters, their breath fogging in the air as they prepared for the first prayers of the day. It was a shared experience, across villages and valleys, this quiet communion with the cold. Some believed the soul wandered freely during this time, slipping between dreams and waking. The mind was said to open in strange ways before dawn when the fire was low and the body half frozen. People spoke of seeing faint lights through the cracks of their shutters, of hearing voices whispering in the frost. Most dismissed it as tricks of the mind, born from exhaustion, but there were always a few who swore the cold itself could think that it had a presence, patient and observing, that watched as people slept. There is a peculiar truth to how the cold distorts perception. Time stretches. The minutes feel like hours. The light from the hearth seems to fade faster than it should. The shadows lengthen and move, not because of ghosts, but because of the trembling flame that refuses to stay still. Those who sat awake through these hours sometimes spoke of feeling outside of time, as though they were the only soul left awake in creation. There's something hauntingly peaceful in that idea to exist for a few moments in a world stripped of noise and motion. In villages, the long hours before dawn were also practical ones. It was when bread was set to rise by those who could afford flour, when water was drawn before it froze solid, when a mother might nurse her child by the dim orange glow of the embers. The tasks were simple, almost ritualistic. Each movement stirring the ashes, laying another log, carried a quiet purpose. To survive the winter meant mastering these small gestures, these ordinary acts that kept the night from swallowing the home entirely. Outside, the world slept differently. Snow blanketed everything in silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hesitate. Trees stood like dark monuments, their branches heavy with frost. In the distance, faint plumes of smoke curled from cottage chimneys, rising straight into the still air. Sometimes, if you stepped outside in that hour though, few dared. The sky would be full of stars so sharp they looked carved from ice. The world felt endless and empty all at once. Those who stayed inside learned to read the signs of dawn without clocks or candles. The cold itself changed first. It grew deeper, paradoxically sharper, as if the night were tightening its grip before letting go. Then came a faint shift in light, a soft grey that crept along the edges of the window, barely perceptible. The roosters would begin their uncertain calls, not because the sun was up, but because they sensed its promise. And still, the people waited, lying half awake, unwilling to leave their fragile warmth. There's an old tale from the north of a man who stayed awake through every night of one winter, convinced that if he slept, the cold would claim his soul. Each morning, he survived, though his eyes grew duller, his thoughts slower. When spring finally came, they say he slept for 3 days straight and woke unable to remember his own name. It's just a story, of course, but perhaps it says something about how the cold seeps into the mind. It doesn't just freeze the body, it dulls the sense of time, of memory, of self. The hours before dawn were also when dreams were most vivid. People often dreamed of warmth of summers they barely remembered, of rivers running freely, of the sun as a living thing. These dreams carried a strange weight, like visits from another world. Some would wake with tears frozen on their cheeks, the memory of the warmth already slipping away. It's a quiet cruelty to be shown comfort in sleep, only to wake and find frost instead. And yet, within that misery, there was still a rhythm to life, a fragile endurance. A man would rise, stir the coals, blow softly until the flame returned. His breath mingled with the smoke, disappearing into the dim air. A woman would wrap her shawl tighter, hum softly to herself, her song no louder than the crackle of the embers. In those moments, the line between life and stillness blurred. Every act, every breath, every whisper was resistance. As dawn approached, the fire began to respond again, flickering more eagerly, sensing its own reprieve. The colour of the light changed from red to gold, from gold to something pale and thin, and when the first ray of sunlight finally slipped through the window, it revealed everything the darkness had hidden: the frost on the walls, the sleeping faces, the quiet exhaustion that came from simply surviving the night. It's strange to think that for them, the coming of light was not a triumphant thing. It was gentler, quieter, a slow return to motion. The sound of feet on the floorboards, the creak of wooden doors, the soft murmur of voices waking to another day. The night had not been conquered, it had simply passed, and that was enough. In a way, those long hours before dawn were a mirror of medieval life itself, a long endurance held together by small rituals, dim light, and the belief that morning would always come, even if only faintly. The people of that time didn't dream of conquering the cold, they dreamed of outlasting it. Each night survived was a quiet victory, marked not by joy, but by the simple, steady continuation of life. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with that part of the mind that remembers silence, you can almost hear it. The faint crackle of embers, the sigh of sleeping breath, the stillness that fills, the gap between one moment and the next. The world, half frozen, waiting. The fire, still alive. The night, slowly yielding its grip to the light of another day. It's strange to imagine now that inside the very places meant to offer warmth and safety, people could still see their breath drift in the air like tiny ghosts of winter, the breath that froze indoors. That phrase alone feels wrong, doesn't it? But in the medieval world, it was a quiet, daily truth. Even the walls could not keep out the cold. It crept through cracks, through thatched roofs, through the very stones themselves, until it lived among them. When people exhaled in those dim, smoky rooms, the air turned white before their eyes. The mist lingered, shivering in the faint light of a dying fire. Some mornings, the frost had crept so far that the inside of the window shutters glittered like they'd been painted with silver dust. A strange kind of beauty, found only in hardship, the kind that looks still and peaceful until you remember how it feels on skin. Imagine sitting in a cottage at the edge of a medieval village. The fire is barely glowing, just a handful of embers trying to hold on to life. You draw your blanket tighter, but even the blanket feels like it has given up, its edges stiff, its threads cold to the touch. You can hear the faint creak of wood, the small pops of the hearth, and somewhere beyond the walls, the groan of the wind shifting through the trees. It's the sound of a world where everything, even air, has turned solid. There's a certain cruelty to that kind of cold. Not violent, not sudden, just patient. It waits. It works its way through everything you own, everything you are. And when you finally see your breath bloom into fog before your face, you realize something subtle. You are living in a space that nature has reclaimed. The house no longer belongs to you, it belongs to winter. To survive it, people learned strange rituals. They covered walls with hanging cloths to block drafts. They stuffed gaps in the wood with moss, with straw, even with mud. They hung their clothing near the ceiling beams so it wouldn't freeze stiff overnight. But still, when dawn came, a film of ice would coat the water jug, and the floor would sparkle with frost. The fire, even if it survived the night, would be ash and faint smoke by morning. Everything felt still. Time itself seemed frozen. And yet, this stillness was part of life. People didn't see it as remarkable. They accepted the way their breath fogged in the air as calmly as we accept the ticking of a clock. Children sometimes traced their fingers through the frost on the inside of windows, drawing circles and lines before it melted under their touch. It was a quiet game, one played by those who didn't yet understand the weight of cold. But for the adults, every visible breath was a reminder. It meant that warmth was fleeting, that firewood was running low, that tonight, perhaps, the cold would be harder to push away. They learned to measure their lives in the space between breaths, the moments when fog vanished and the next one began. Each exhale was proof that they were still here, still enduring. There were tales, whispered in villages, of nights so cold that one could freeze before dawn without ever stepping outside. People spoke of travellers found stiff beside their hearths, their faces peaceful, their blankets pulled up to the chin as though sleep had simply deepened into something permanent. Whether true or not, such stories lingered, passed down like warnings wrapped in lullabies. In monasteries, the chill was worse. The stone walls, centuries old, absorbed cold like a sponge. Monks would wake in the early dark for prayers, their breath forming clouds around them as they murmured Latin into the frigid silence. They described the air as heavy, not because it pressed down, but because it refused to move. Candles shivered, their flames bent sideways by invisible drafts, and drops of wax froze in strange, half-melted shapes. There's a curious record from the 14th century, a scribe who noted that his ink had frozen mid-sentence. His quill cracked the thin layer of ice that had formed inside the inkwell. He wrote about how his breath left tiny crystals on the parchment, how he had to pause to warm his fingers over a candle before continuing. That image stays with you, words trapped between breaths of frozen air. The cold didn't just affect comfort, it shaped rhythm. Meals were delayed because bread hardened overnight. Water had to be thawed before washing could begin. People learned to move slower, speak softer. Even laughter felt muted, as if sound itself had thickened. In that kind of silence, one becomes aware of the smallest noises, the slow drip of thawing ice, the rustle of hay in the corner, the creak of a door shifting in its frozen frame, and sometimes the air itself began to whisper. As the temperature dropped, wood and metal contracted, making faint, sharp sounds that seemed alive, soft knocks, distant cracks, as if the house were breathing along with you. Some said those were the voices of the cold. Others said it was the old timbers remembering warmth. But the truth is quieter. The world was simply shrinking, folding itself inward, waiting for the sun. It's easy to think of this as suffering, and in many ways it was. But there was also something strangely intimate about those frozen nights. Families huddled close, not out of affection, but survival. Yet in that closeness, warmth became more than temperature. It became a feeling shared breath, quiet companionship, a fire's faint glow reflected in tired eyes. In the stillness of that frozen world, every flicker of light, every sigh of breath mattered deeply. So, when you think of the medieval winter, try to picture it not as distant history, but as a living rhythm. The breath that froze indoors wasn't just a symbol of the cold, it was a kind of silent communion with it. Every time they exhaled, they left a trace of life in the air, visible proof that the cold hadn't won yet. And in that fragile cloud of white mist, there was a small, persistent kind of hope. There's something quietly haunting about the idea of a village that never truly slept, where rest came in fragments, and warmth had to be shared like a borrowed secret. In the frozen heart of winter, many medieval villages did exactly that. They slept in shifts, not out of choice, but necessity. The night was too long, the cold too deep, and the fire too precious to be trusted to chance. Imagine it, a cluster of wooden cottages, their roofs buried under frost, smoke barely rising from the chimneys. Inside, families gathered close, wrapped in whatever scraps of warmth they could find. The fire in the hearth was small but sacred, a single point of light in a sea of darkness. It had to burn all night, because if it went out, the cold would seep in like a living thing, curling around every sleeping body until it stilled even breath. To keep that fire alive, people took turns staying awake. One person, sometimes two, would sit near the hearth, feeding it bits of wood, poking the embers gently when they began to fade. These were the watchers of the night, their eyes half closed, their faces painted orange by the glow. They didn't speak much. Words felt heavy in such quiet hours. Instead, they listened to the wind pressing against the walls, to the muffled breathing of those asleep, to the faint crackle of wood surrendering to flame. Outside, the world was motionless. The snow lay thick, undisturbed, reflecting the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The air was so cold that even sound seemed to freeze. No dogs barked, no footsteps echoed. Just silence, a silence so complete it felt like time had stopped. And within that silence, a single human wakefulness glowed, guarding against a world that waited to swallow it whole. When the watcher grew too tired, another would rise. Sometimes it was the eldest son, sometimes the mother, sometimes a neighbour who'd come to share the long hours. The torch of wakefulness passed quietly from one to the next. They didn't think of it as duty, it was rhythm, the same as breathing, as natural as night following day. The village survived on that rhythm, half awake, half asleep, always listening to the whisper of the fire. In some regions, this habit became a custom. They called it the first sleep and the second sleep. People would lie down after sunset, sleep for a few hours, wake in the middle of the night, and sit by the fire until the second sleep took them. During that waking period, they mended clothes, whispered prayers, or just stared into the embers in silence. Some believed the hours between sleeps were sacred, a time when thoughts came clearer, when the soul was most open. Others simply used it to make sure the fire didn't die. It's easy to imagine this pattern as exhausting, but in truth, it carried a kind of calm rhythm. The villagers learned to move slowly, to breathe with the fire's pulse. Each pop of burning wood marked the passing of time. The night stretched on endlessly, yet felt strangely measured. The watchers counted not hours, but how many logs remained before dawn. And there was something else, something quiet and strange that lingered in those hours. When most of the village slept and the firelight flickered low, people often said they heard things, not frightening things, just soft presences. The faint shuffle of feet outside when no one walked there. The whisper of old voices in the smoke. Perhaps it was only the wind slipping through the cracks. Or the mind, tired and half-dreaming, shaping the silence into something familiar. But those who kept watch long enough swore that winter nights spoke in their own language. In one English account from the 13th century, a farmer wrote that the house breathed when it froze, the timbers expanding and sighing as if restless. He said it was like the cottage itself was alive, waiting with them through the long dark. Such ideas weren't superstition exactly, they were comfort. In a world so still and isolating, it helped to believe that one wasn't truly alone. When the shift changed, the watchers would touch hands briefly, a small exchange of warmth, a silent acknowledgement that both were still alive, still enduring. No words were needed. They moved quietly so as not to wake the others. The sleepers' faces were pale in the firelight, breath visible with each exhale, their blankets rising and falling in slow rhythm. Even in rest, they seemed aware of the cold pressing just beyond the walls. By the time the faintest blue of morning crept into the windows, everyone felt the same dull ache behind their eyes. Sleep had been scattered, divided into fragments like brittle glass, but the fire had survived. The village had made it through another night, and as strange as it seems, there was comfort in that repetition. Each night endured was a small victory, each dawn a quiet relief. You might wonder, how did they live like this for months on end? How did anyone ever feel rested? The answer, perhaps, is that they didn't think of sleep the way we do. Rest wasn't something to be earned or counted. It was something to be shared. It came in pieces: a nap near the hearth, a doze after dawn, a few hours stolen while someone else watched the flames. No one slept fully, yet somehow everyone survived. There's a quiet beauty in that kind of existence. In a world where every spark mattered, every shared breath meant survival. The cold demanded cooperation. Isolation meant danger, but togetherness meant warmth, literal and emotional. The act of watching the fire wasn't just about keeping it alive, it was about reminding themselves that they were still part of something, a living, breathing rhythm, fragile but unbroken. In some villages, the watchers developed little rituals to stay awake. They'd whisper small stories to themselves, hum old songs, or carve tiny marks into wood to count the hours. One might imagine them speaking softly to the fire, as though it were an old friend. They'd lean close and murmur, "Stay with us, just a little longer." And in a way, it did. The flame answered in crackles, in the subtle shift of orange light against stone walls. What's most haunting about this image is not the hardship itself, but the quiet persistence within it, the calm endurance of people who expected nothing more than to last until morning. It's easy to romanticize them, to imagine stoic villagers wrapped in furs, heroic in their patience. But they weren't thinking about history or legacy. They were just trying to live through another winter night, one log at a time. And maybe that's what makes their story strangely soothing, because beneath all the frost and silence, there's a simple truth that even in the most brutal cold, life continues, softly, stubbornly. A fire flickers, someone stays awake, someone else dreams, and the village breathes together through the dark, the village that slept in shifts. Not a grand tale of heroism, but of small, repeated courage, a rhythm of survival that turned every frozen night into something almost sacred. They didn't fight the cold, they coexisted with it, sharing warmth, sharing time, and waiting, patiently, for the light to return. There's something deeply unsettling about silence inside a barn. It's not supposed to be quiet there. Normally you'd hear the shifting of hooves, the low breath of animals, the soft rustle of hay. But in the depths of a medieval winter, many barns fell silent not from peace, but from exhaustion, from cold that crept so deep it reached the living hearts of the creatures that filled those wooden spaces. The frozen animals, and the hollow barns they left behind, became an invisible part of winter's story. Livestock were life in the Middle Ages. A family's survival depended on them. Cows for milk, sheep for wool, hens for eggs, all fragile, all vulnerable when the frost came early and stayed too long. So when the air turned bitter and the wind began to whistle through the slats of old wood, people brought their animals as close to the warmth as possible. Sometimes they even shared the same roof, sleeping beside the beasts in the same dim light, hoping that shared breath might keep everyone alive. You can imagine it, a small stone cottage at the edge of a sleeping village, the smell of smoke and hay mingling in the air. A cow sighs in the corner, its breath rising like steam. Chickens huddle together under a blanket of straw. Somewhere near the door, a thin dog curls itself into a perfect circle, nose pressed against tail. The floor is hard, the air thick with the faint scent of damp wool and ash. And above it all, the constant, low hum of living, breathing, shivering, enduring. But not all animals made it through those nights. The cold was merciless, and firewood was precious. People had to choose, keep the hearth burning for the children, or drag the last embers to the barn to save a cow that might not last the week. Sometimes they tried both, moving between spaces, carrying a bowl of coals wrapped in cloth like a small sun, hoping to chase away the frost just long enough. Often it wasn't enough. When morning came, some barns would be too still. Frost clung to fur. The air was sharp, unmoving. A chicken's wing frozen half open, a sheep stiff beside its feed. There was grief, yes, but it was quiet. The villagers had learned not to cry too long in winter. Tears froze quickly, and sorrow had to wait until spring. And yet, even in that bleakness, there was something almost reverent about the way they treated their animals. Some covered the fallen, beasts with hay, whispering small blessings. Others carved tiny marks into the barn doors, hoping to ward off more loss. There was no drama in these gestures, no ceremony, just the slow, silent work of people who understood that life and death shared the same space during winter. The barns themselves seemed to breathe with memory. In the half-light, the walls creaked, the rafters moaned, and the hay shifted softly, as if remembering the movement of animals long gone. Some said that if you stood still enough at night, you could hear them, the faint shuffle of hooves, the soft snort of invisible horses, the echo of life that used to fill the silence. Perhaps it was only wind slipping through the gaps, or the mind making stories to fill the emptiness. But it comforted them, the idea that something, even a ghost of warmth, remained. There's a curious note in a 15th century farming record from northern France. It describes a winter so severe that the ink froze inside the pen as the writer worked. He wrote that the barns hollowed, meaning not just empty, but echoing. The words stayed with him. He described standing inside one of those barns, hearing the wind whistle through the rafters, and realizing that the sound of life had gone. It was, he said, a sound like forgetting. That phrase, a sound like forgetting, feels almost too perfect, because that's what the frozen barns were. Echoes of something that had been there and was gone too soon. To survive such winters, farmers learned to share what warmth they could. They filled the barns with layers of hay so thick it nearly reached the beams. They sealed doors with old sacks and hung bits of cloth to block the wind. Some even lit small fires inside hollowed-out clay pots, dangerous but sometimes worth the risk. There are stories of shepherds who sang to their sheep through the night, not for comfort, but to keep themselves awake, so the animals wouldn't freeze unattended. Their voices low, rhythmic, lost in the breath of winter. And yet, there were moments of beauty among the hardship. On certain mornings, when the first sunlight touched the frost-covered hay, the barns shimmered. Every straw glittered like glass. The animals that survived blinked slowly in the pale light, steam rising from their nostrils like incense. The humans would stand there for a moment, silent, watching the small miracle of breath returning to the world. A reminder that not everything had frozen. It's hard to imagine that kind of existence now, where warmth was an achievement and the survival of every creature depended on small, repeated acts of care. Modern winters are loud. Heaters hum, cars move, lights glow. But back then, the world shrank into itself. Life slowed to the rhythm of breath and silence. Each living thing, human or animal, shared the same fragile battle against the cold. And somehow, that made the bond between them stronger. Survival wasn't separate. It was collective. There's one more curious detail that lingers from that era. In some parts of northern Europe, villagers believed that animals could speak on the coldest night of the year just for a moment at the stroke of midnight. It wasn't seen as frightening. It was seen as sacred. The animals, they said, whispered their suffering to God, asking for mercy from the frost. People would leave the barns undisturbed that night, stepping quietly around them, listening but never entering. A strange tradition, but maybe, in a way, a reflection of guilt. Because humans and beasts were enduring the same torment, but only one of them could light a fire. As winter deepened, barns became both sanctuary and tomb, hollow spaces filled with echoes and memory. And yet, they also held the promise of spring, the faint scent of hay, the sound of a single surviving lamb, the creak of a door opening to let in sunlight. Life didn't return all at once. It crept back in, cautious, like warmth testing the edges of the world again. And so, when we speak of medieval winters, it's easy to think only of human endurance, the cold hands, the sleepless nights, the frozen breath. But in truth, the story isn't complete without the animals, without the barns that held both life and loss. They were companions in silence, witnesses to the same frozen nights, They too waited for dawn, breathing the same cold air, longing for the same fragile light. Even now, if you walk through an old village and find a crumbling barn at its edge, try standing inside for a moment. Listen to the wind through the boards. Feel how the air shifts. You might sense it, that faint hum of something ancient. The memory of lives that once breathed together, and the long, quiet winters they survived. There's something quietly fascinating about how weather shapes faith, how a season, repeated long enough, can change what people believe about the world itself. In the medieval winters, when the cold felt endless and the sun vanished behind a veil of grey for months on end, people began to see the cold not as mere nature, but as something divine or something cursed. The cold that changed their beliefs didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in, year after year, until it became a part of their understanding of God, of life, and of death. In the stillness of frozen nights, when prayers turned to mist in the air, villagers spoke softly of spirits that rode on the wind. They said the cold was a punishment, or a test, or perhaps a whisper from the heavens reminding them of their smallness. When the crops failed and the rivers froze over so solidly that even the fish seemed gone, people turned to their churches, but even there, the cold followed. Candles sputtered in the draughts. Frost formed along the edges of the altar. The stone walls of the chapel groaned under the weight of ice. It must have been strange to kneel in prayer and see your own breath drifting before you, as if your soul were leaving your body with every exhale. Some monks began to write about the cold as a kind of presence. They didn't call it evil, exactly, but they sensed intention in it. One wrote that the frost walks through the cloister like a visitor. Another noted that when the snow fell heavy and the bells froze silent, it felt as though the world itself had been paused by unseen hands. In those moments, faith didn't disappear, it deepened, but in quieter, more uncertain ways. People stopped asking why and began asking how long. In the northern villages, there were tales of the winter saint, a ghostly figure said to wander through blizzards with a lantern, guiding lost souls to safety. Some said it was the spirit of a monk who'd frozen while searching for firewood. Others believed it was an angel, one of the cold ones, not burning but shining with pale light. Parents told the story to children as they huddled near the fire, not to frighten them, but to remind them that even in the deepest cold, there might still be mercy walking unseen among them. But not all beliefs brought comfort. There were darker ideas too, when the cold grew unbearable and animals died in their stalls. Some whispered that winter was punishment for sins, forgotten that someone in the village had offended the divine order. It's easy to judge that now, from the warmth of modern life, but back then, faith was the only thing that explained what reason could not. When warmth itself abandoned you, how could you not see it as a message? Priests began to weave the cold into their sermons. They spoke of humility, of patience, of endurance as virtue. They compared winter to purgatory, a long, cleansing suffering before redemption. Some even described the frost as a kind of grace, because it revealed who could endure, who would keep faith when all else froze. The cold, they said, was God's way of reminding man that he did not control the seasons of his own soul. And still, there were the small, strange rituals. In some parts of Scandinavia, people placed bread outside their doors during the longest nights, offerings not to saints, but to the spirits of winter itself. In the Alps, families burned herbs and pine needles to smoke out the chill, believing that the scent could drive away misfortune. Even the simplest acts, like lighting a candle before sleep, carried a weight of devotion. Light became more than light. It was defiance, prayer, and hope all at once. What's interesting is how these beliefs softened over time, rather than hardened. People didn't fight the cold in anger. They accepted it as a teacher. It taught them silence, patience, and reverence. It forced them to look inward, to measure strength not by action, but by endurance. In the records of medieval mystics, winter is described again and again as both trial and revelation. They wrote of the mind slowing down, of thoughts becoming simple, still, pure, like snow covering the earth, hiding everything except what truly mattered. There's a peculiar story from 12th century Germany of a nun who claimed that she heard the voice of God not in warmth or fire, but in frost. She said the icicles outside her window rang like chimes at dawn, and that in their sound she heard the quiet patience of the heavens. The abbess who recorded her words didn't dismiss her. Instead, she wrote that perhaps the divine spoke differently to those who endured long winters, not through miracles of light, but through the stillness of cold. A strange, gentle theology born from frost. And maybe that's what the cold really did. It redefined what holiness felt like. Warmth was no longer proof of blessing. Comfort wasn't evidence of faith. In those frozen lands, holiness became something quieter, a calm breath in the dark, a candle that refused to die, a hand offered to someone shivering beside you. The sacred was found in survival and the divine in persistence. Some scholars now call this the theology of winter, though it wasn't theology in the formal sense. It was simply lived belief, a way of finding meaning in hardship, when you have nothing left but breath, and even that turns to frost before your eyes. Faith becomes something you can hold only in silence, and somehow that silence feels truer than all the hymns ever sung in summer. It's easy to forget that cold changes not just the body, but the imagination. The medieval world learned to see life itself as seasonal. The cold came, and it left, and with it came renewal. Death, in their eyes, was just another winter, not an end, but a long sleep before the thaw. That idea comforted them, even as snow piled high on graves, even as the frost bit through stone. If you visit old churches in northern Europe, you'll sometimes see strange carvings tucked away near the doors, small faces surrounded by leaves and ice, half human, half frozen. They're not saints, they're not demons, they're something in between. Perhaps the last echoes of an older, quieter understanding that cold itself was a kind of spirit, one that could destroy, but also preserve. After all, frost kills the weak, but it also keeps things from rotting. It ends, but it also protects. And maybe that's the truest reflection of faith those winters left behind, a belief that loss and preservation can live together. That warmth is precious because it's fleeting. That silence can be sacred. And that endurance, even without explanation, might be the purest form of prayer. The cold didn't turn them into philosophers or saints. It simply reminded them that belief, like survival, is something small and human, something that shivers, that falters, that hopes. The frost didn't just settle on their windows, it settled in their souls. But from it, they learned a gentler truth that sometimes even the hardest seasons are just another way the world teaches us how to stay alive. When morning finally came, it did not come suddenly. It arrived as a faint light pressed through a veil of frost, soft, pale, and uncertain. The first dawn, after a long freeze, never felt like victory. It was quieter than that. The snow no longer fell, but hung in the air, glittering faintly like dust in a dream. The village, wrapped in stillness, seemed almost sacred in its silence. It was as if the world itself had paused, allowing everything, even time, to take one slow, fragile breath. Inside the cottages, people stirred from uneasy sleep. Their breath still lingered like smoke, rising and fading in the dim morning light. The fires, long since turned to embers, gave only a faint glow, not enough to warm the air, but enough to remind them that warmth, though weak, still existed. They moved quietly, not speaking much. After nights like that, words felt unnecessary. There was a kind of reverence in surviving. The frost had crept into every corner of life, wooden spoons stuck to bowls, Water buckets had frozen solid. The bread, left by the hearth, had turned to stone overnight. Even the walls groaned faintly as the cold retreated, leaving behind the delicate scars of ice that melted like tears down rough plaster. Yet, there was something beautiful in it, a fragile beauty, like waking from a dream that had almost become death. Outside, the air was still, but not cruel anymore. The snow underfoot made no sound, only a gentle sigh when stepped upon. The trees stood bare and glass-like, each branch coated in silver frost that shimmered faintly as the light grew. Birds began to stir in the distance, not singing yet, just moving, as if unsure whether the world was ready for sound again. The villagers looked out at the frozen fields and the pale horizon, and for the first time in many days, they saw colour returning. Faint but real. The faint gold of dawn against the endless white. For some, that morning was a miracle. For others, it was simply another day to begin again to gather wood, to break ice, to feed what animals had survived the long night. The frost had claimed much, and yet it left behind a strange kind of purity. Everything was clean, quiet, and new. It was as if the cold had stripped the world down to its barest truth. No noise, no rush, no pretension, only existence. There are records from travellers who described mornings like this, the eerie calm after the cold. One wrote that the silence felt too complete, as if the world feared to disturb it. Another said that the light seemed to fall slower, as though even the sun had to warm its own way through the frozen air. But the strangest of all was the way people described their own hearts, slower, heavier, but peaceful. The cold had emptied them, and now, in the pale dawn, they felt something close to gratitude. In some villages, it was said that the first breath taken after the freeze carried meaning, that the air itself remembered the night before, and that whoever breathed it deeply would carry part of winter's wisdom, patience, humility, and silence. Old women told children not to speak for the first few minutes after waking, so the body could listen to the frost leaving. It sounds superstitious now, but in those days, the line between the natural and the sacred was thin, and every small act carried the weight of ritual. By midday, the snow began to soften. Drops of water slid down from rooftops, catching light like tiny crystals. Smoke rose again from the chimneys, thin at first, then steady. The sound of metal striking wood returned as men split logs outside. Life resumed slowly, cautiously, like a candle rekindled after a long dark. Even the animals, stiff and starved, began to move again, blinking at the pale sky. The world was still wounded by the cold, but it was healing. Quietly, in its own rhythm. The strangest thing, though, was how people looked at the world that day. They spoke little, but their eyes were softer. The cold had taken their sleep, their comfort, even their certainty, and yet it had given something back, too, a kind of quiet awe. The frost had shown them what it meant to endure without promise, to keep faith in the absence of warmth. That morning, every small sound, the drip of melting snow, the sigh of wind against a door felt like a blessing. Later, as the sun finally broke through the thin mist, the light spread across the fields in slow ripples of gold. It touched everything, the roofs, the fences, the frozen wells, and the ice began to glitter like 1,000 tiny mirrors. People stepped outside and just stood there, not to work, but simply to see. Some smiled faintly, others just closed their eyes. After days of darkness, the world was unbearably bright, but no one turned away. It felt like the earth itself was breathing again, slow and deep. Somewhere in that stillness, a strange thought often came to those who had endured such nights, that perhaps the cold had its own kind of memory, that it remembered every life it had touched, every breath that had hung frozen in the air. Maybe that's why the frost always returned, year after year, as if to visit old friends, to test the living, to remind them of silence. The idea sounds haunting, but it carried a quiet comfort too, for if the cold remembered them, perhaps they were not forgotten by the world. And when evening came again, though gentler this time, with less fear people prepared their fires and meals in calm contentment, the cottages filled with the scent of wood smoke and thawing earth. The frost still glimmered faintly outside, but it no longer threatened. It was simply there, a silent witness to everything that had endured. The villagers knew it would come again next year, and the year after, but for now there was warmth, and that was enough. As darkness returned, the sky above was clear for the first time in weeks. The stars seemed impossibly sharp, each one reflected in the patches of melting ice below. The air was still cold, but softer now, a cold you could live with. Children fell asleep quickly, wrapped in their straw beds, the sounds of the wind no longer a menace but a lullaby. Somewhere a church bell rang, faint and distant, marking the end of the long freeze. And perhaps, in that moment, something changed, not in the weather, but in the hearts of those who had survived it. They understood now that endurance was not the absence of fear, but the quiet acceptance of it, that even the harshest nights end in light, and that warmth, no matter how small, always finds its way back. So, as the frost melted from the window panes, and the final embers glowed low in the hearth, the world exhaled at last. The long winter night was over. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of memory, of breath, of life, returning inch by inch. And to you, listening now, in the calm after the story, may your own night be gentle, your breath steady, and your rest deep. The cold has passed. The morning will come again. Good night.